The 5 orange pips. When I glance over my notes and records of Sherlock Holmes's case between the years of 82 and 90, I am faced with so many which present strange and interesting features that it is no easy matter to know which to choose or which to leave. Some, however, have already gained publicity through the papers, and others have not offered a field of those particular qualities of my friend possessed in so high a degree, and which it is the object of the papers to illustrate. Some, too, have baffled his analytical skill, and would be, as narratives, beginning without an ending, while others have been but partially cleared up, and have their explanations founded rather upon conjecture and surmise, rather than the absolute logical proof which was so dear to him. There is, however, one of these last which was so remarkable in its details, and so startling in its results, that I am tempted to give some account of it in spite of the fact that there are points of connection with it which have never been, and probably never will be, entirely cleared up. The year 87 furnished us with a long series of cases of greater or less interest, of which I retain the records. Among my headings under the 12 months I find an account of the adventure of the parallel chamber of the Amateur Meditant Society, which held a luxurious club in the lower vault of a furniture warehouse, of the facts connected with the loss of the British bark Sophie Anderson, of the singular adventures of Grace Patterson of the island of Ufa, and finally of the Camberwell poisoning case. In the latter, as may be remembered, Sherlock Holmes was able, by winding up the dead man's watch, to prove that it had been wound up 2 hours before, and that before the deceased had gone to bed within that time, a deduction which was the greatest importance in clearing up the case. All these I may sketch out at some future date, but none of them present such singular features as a strange train of circumstances which I have now taken up my pen to describe. It was the later days of September, and the equinoctial gales had set in the exceptional violence. All day the wind had screamed and the rain had beaten against the windows, so that even here in the heart of great handmade London we are forced to raise our minds for the instance of the routine of life, and to recognize the presence of those great elemental forces which shriek at mankind through the bars of his civilization like untamed beasts in a cage. As evening drew in, the storm grew higher and louder, and the wind cried and sobbed like a child in the chimney. Sherlock Holmes sat moodily at one side of the fireplace, cross-indexing his records of crime, while I at the other was deep in one of my Clock Russell's fine sea stories, until the howl of the gale from the without seemed to blend in with the text, and a splash of rain to lengthen out into the long swash of the sea waves. My wife was on a visit to her mother's, and for a few days I was a dweller once more in my old quarters at Baker Street. "Why," said I, glancing up at my companion, "that was surely the bell. Who would come tonight? Some friend of yours, perhaps?" "Except yourself, I have none," he answered. "I do not encourage visitors." "A client, then?" "If so, it is a serious case. Nothing less would bring a man out on such a day and at such an hour. But I take it that it is more likely to be some crony of the landlady's." Sherlock Holmes was wrong in his conjecture, however, for there came a step in the passage and a tapping at the door. He stretched out his long arm to turn the lamp away from himself and towards a vacant chair upon which the newcomer must sit. "Come in," he said. The man who entered was a young, some 22 at the outside, well-groomed and trimly clad, with something of a refinement and delicacy in his bearing. The streaming umbrella which he held in his hand, and his long, shining windproof, told of the fierce weather through which he had come. He looked about him anxiously in the glare of the lamp, and I could see that his face was pale and his eyes heavy, like those of a man who is weighed down by some ghastly anxiety. "I owe you an apology," he said, raising his golden pincers to his eyes. "I trust that I'm not intruding. I fear that I have brought some traces of the storm and rain onto your snug chamber." "Give me a coat and umbrella," said Holmes. "They may rest here on the hook, and will be dry presently. You have come up with the south side, I believe?" "Yes, I'm from Horsham." "That clay and chalk mixture which I see upon your toe caps is quite distinctive." "I have come for advice." "That is easily got." "And help?" "That is not always so easy." "I've heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I've heard from Major Pendergast how you saved him in the Tankerville Club scandal." "Ah, of course. He was wrongfully accused of cheating at cards." "It said that you could solve anything." "He said too much." "That you're never beaten?" "I have been beaten 4 times. 3 times by men, and once by a woman." "But what does that compare to the number of your successes?" "It is true that I have been generally successful." "Then you may have been so with me?" "I beg that you will draw up your chair by the fire and favor me with some details as to your case." "It is no ordinary one." "None of those which come to me are. I am the last court of appeal." "And yet I question, sir, whether in all your experiences have you ever listened to a more mysterious and inexplicable chain of events than those that have happened to my own family." "You fill me with interest," said Holmes. "Pray give us the essential facts from the commencement, and I shall afterwards question you as to those details which seem to me to be the most important." "My name," he said, "is John Openshaw. But my own affairs have, as far as I can understand, have little to do with the awful business. It is a hereditary matter, so in order to give me the idea of the facts, I must go back to the commencement of the affair. You must know that my grandfather had 2 sons, my uncle Elias and my father Joseph. My father had a small factory in Coventry, which he enlarged at the time of the invention of bicycling. He has a patentee of the Openshaw unbreakable tire, and his business met with such success that he was able to sell it to retire upon a handsome consequence. My uncle Elias emigrated to America when he was a young man, and became a planter in Florida, where he was reported to have done very well. At the time of the war, he fought with Jackson's army, and afterwards he rose to be a colonel. When Lee laid down his arms, my uncle returned to his plantation, where he remained for 3 or 4 years. About 1869 or 1870, he came back to Europe and took a small estate in Sussex, near Horsham. He made a very considerable fortune in the States, and his reason for leaving them was his aversion to the Negroes, and his dislike for the Republican Party in extending the franchise to them. He was a singular man, fierce and quick-tempered, very foul-mouthed when he was angry, and the most retiring disposition. During all the years that he lived in Horsham, I doubt if he ever set foot in the town. He had a garden and 2 or 3 fields around his house. There he would take his exercise, though very often for weeks on end he would never leave his room. He drank a great deal of brandy and smoked very heavily, but he would not see no society and did not want any friends, not even his own brother. He didn't mind me, in fact. He took a fancy to me, for at the time when he saw me I was a youngster of 12 or so. This would be in the year 1878, after he had been 8 or 9 years in England. He begged my father to let me live with him, and he was very kind to me in his way. When he was sober, he used to be fond of playing backgammon and draughts with me, and he would make me his representative both with the servants and with the tradespeople, so that by the time I was 16, I was quite master of the house. I kept all the keys, and I could go where I liked and do what I liked, as long as I did not disturb him in his privacy. There was one singular exception, however. He had a single room, a lumber room, up among the attics, which was invariably locked, and which he would never permit me to go. With a boy's curiosity, I have peeped through the keyhole, and I was never able to see much beyond an old collection of trunks and bundles, as would be expected in such a room. One day, it was March 1883, a letter with a foreign stamp lay upon the table in front of the colonel's plate. It was not a common thing for him to receive letters, for his bills were all paid with ready money, and he had no friends of any sort. "From India," said he, and had to look it up. "Pondicherry postmark. What can this be?" Opening it hurriedly, out jumped 3 or 5 little dried orange pips, which pattered down upon his plate, and I began to laugh at this, but the laugh was struck from my lips with the side of his face. His lip had fallen, his eyes were protruding, his skin the color of putty, and he glared at the envelope which he still held in his trembling hands. "K.K.K," he shrieked, and then, my God, my sins have overtaken me." "What is it, uncle?" I cried. "Death," said he, and rising from the table he retired to his room, leaving me palpitating in horror. I took up the envelope and saw scrawled in red ink upon the inner flap, just above the gum, the letter K 3 times, repeated. There was nothing else save for the 5 dried pips. What could be the reason of his overpowering terror? I left the breakfast table and I ascended the stair, and I met him coming down with an old rusty key, which must have belonged to the attic, in one hand, and some small brass box, like a cash box, in the other. They may do what they like, and I'll checkmate them still." And he said with an oath, "Tell Mary that I shall want a fire in my room today, and send down to Fordham and Horsham lawyer." I did as he ordered, and when the lawyer arrived, I was asked to step up to the room. The fire was burning brightly, and in the grate there was a mass of black, fluffy ashes, as of burned paper, while the brass box stood open and empty inside. As I glanced at the box, I noticed with a start that upon the lid was printed the treble K which I had read on the morning open on the envelope. "I wish you, John," said my uncle, "to witness my will. I leave my estate with all the advantages and all its disadvantages to my brother, your father, whence it will no doubt descend to you. If you can enjoy it in peace, well and good. If you cannot, take my advice, my boy, and leave it to your deadliest enemy. I am sorry to give you such a two-edged thing, but I can't say what things are going to take. Kindly sign the paper where Mr. Fordham shows you." I signed the paper as directed, and the lawyer took it away with him. The singular incident made, as you may think, the deepest impression upon me, and I pondered over it and turned it every way in my mind without being able to make anything of it. Yet I could not shake off the vague feeling of dread which it left behind, though the sensation grew less keen as the weeks passed and nothing happened to disturb the usual routine of our lives. I could see a change in my uncle, however. He drank more often, and he was less inclined for any sort of society. Most of the time he would spend in his room with the door locked upon the inside, and sometimes he would emerge in a sort of drunken frenzy and would burst out of the house and tear about the garden with a revolver in his hand, screaming out that he was afraid of no man, and that he was not to be cooped up like a sheep in a pen by man or devil. When these hot fits were over, however, he would rush tumultuously back into the door, locked it, and barred it behind him, like a man who can brazen it out no longer against the terror which lies at the root of his soul. At such times I have seen his face, even on a cold day, glisten with moisture, as though it were new raised from the basin. Well, to come to an end of the matter, Mr. Holmes, and not to abuse your patience, there came a night when he made one of those drunken sallies from which he never came back. We found him, and we went to search for him, and face downward in a little green-scummed pool which lay at the foot of the garden. There was no sign of any violence, and the water was just 2 feet deep, so that the jury, having regard to his own eccentricities, brought the verdict of suicide. But I, who knew how he winced from the very thought of death, had much ado to persuade myself that he had gone this way and to meet it. The matter passed, however, and my father entered the possession of the estate and of some £14,000 which lay to his credit at the bank. "One moment," Holmes interposed. "Your statement is, I foresee, one of the most remarkable I've had ever listened to. Let me have the date of the reception by your uncle of the letter, and the date of his supposed suicide." "The letter arrived on March 10th, 1883. His death was 7 weeks after, upon the night of May 2nd. "Thank you. Pray proceed." "When my father took over the Horsham property, he, at my request, made a careful examination of the attic, which had been always locked up. We found the brass box there, although its contents had been destroyed. On the inside of the cover was a paper label with the initials of K.K.K. repeated upon it, and letters, memoranda, receipts, and a register written beneath. These, we presume, indicated the nature of the papers which he had destroyed by Colonel Openshaw. For the rest, there was nothing of much importance in the attic, save for a great many scattered papers and notebooks bearing my uncle's life in America. Some of them were of the wartime and showed that he had done his brave duty as well as had borne the repute of a brave soldier. Others were of dates during the reconstruction of the southern states, and were mostly concerned with politics, for he had evidently taken a strong part in opposing the carpetbag politicians who had been sent down from the north. Well, it was the beginning of '84 when my father came to live at Horsham, and all went as well as possible until January of '85. On the 4th day after the new year, I heard my father give a sharp cry of surprise as we sat together at the breakfast table. There he was, sitting with a newly opened envelope in one hand and 5 dried orange pips in the outstretched palm of the other one. He had always laughed at what he called my cock-and-bull story about the colonel, but he looked very scared and puzzled now that the same thing had come upon him. "What on earth does it mean, John?" he stammered. My heart had turned to lead. "It's the K.K.K, said I. He looked inside the envelope. "So it is," he cried. "Here are the very letters, but what is this written before them?" "Put the papers on the sundial," I read, peeping over his shoulder. "What papers? What sundial?" he asked. "The sundial in the garden. There is no other," said I. But the papers must be those that are destroyed. Pooh, he said, gripping at his courage. We are a civilized land here, and can't have tomfoolery of the kind. Where does this thing come from? From Dundee, I answered, glancing at the postmark. Some preposterous practical joke, said he. What have I to do with sundials and papers? I shall make no notice of such nonsense. I should certainly speak to police, I said, and he laughed at my pains. Nothing of the sort. Let me do it. No, I forbid you. I won't have any fuss made about such nonsense. It was in vain to argue with him, and he was a very obstinate man. I went about, however, with a heart which was full of foreboding. On the third day after the coming of the letter, my father went from home to visit an old friend, his Major Freebody, who was in command of one of the forts upon Portston Hill. I was glad he should go, for it seemed to me that he was farther from danger when he was away from home. In that, however, I was in error. Upon the second day of his absence, I received a telegram from the Major imploring me to come at once. My father had fallen over into deep chalk pits which abound in the neighborhood, and was lying senseless, with a shattered skull. I hurried to him, but he passed away without ever having recovered his consciousness. He had, as it appears, been returning from Fareham when the two light, and the country was unknown to him, and the chalk pit unfenced. The jury had no hesitation in bringing the verdict of death from accidental causes. Carefully as I examined every fact connected with his death, I was unable to find anything which could suggest the idea of murder. There were no signs of violence, no footmarks, no robbery, no record of strangers having been seen upon the roads. And yet, I need not tell you that my mind was far from at ease, and that I was well nigh certain that some foul plot had been woven around him. In this sinister way I came into my inheritance. You ask me why I did not dispose of it. I answer because I was well convinced that our troubles were in some way dependent upon the accident of my uncle's life, and that the danger would not be pressing in one house as in another. It was in January '85 that my poor father met his end, and 2 years and 8 months have elapsed since then. During that time I have lived happily at Horsham, and I have begun to hope that this curse had passed away from my family, and that it had ended with the last generation. I had begun to take comfort too soon, however. Yesterday morning the blow fell of the very shape in which it had come upon my father. The young man took from his waistcoat a crumpled letter, and turning it on the table, shook out upon it the 5 little dried orange pips. This is the envelope, he continued. The postmark is London, Eastern Division. Within are the very words which were upon my father's last message. K.K.K, and then put the papers on the sundial. What have you done? Asked Holmes. Nothing. Nothing? To tell the truth, he sank his face into his thin white hands. I have felt helpless. I have felt like one of those poor rabbits when the snake is writhing towards it. I seemed to be in the grasp of some resistless, inexorable evil with no foresight, no precautions to guard against it. Tut, tut, cried Sherlock Holmes. You must act, man, or you are lost. Nothing but energy can save you. This is no time for despair. I've seen the police. But they listened to the story with a smile, and convinced that the inspector was formed an opinion of the letters as a practical joke, and that the depths of my relations are really accidents, as the jury stated, and were not to be connected with the warnings. Holmes shook his clenched hands in the air. Incredible imbecility! He cried.
They have, however, allowed me a policeman who may remain at my house with me.
Has he come with you tonight?
No, his orders were to stay in the house.
Again Holmes raved in the air. Why did you come to me? He cried. And above all, why did you not come at once?
I did not know. It was only today when I spoke to Major Pendergast about my troubles and was advised by him to come to you.
It is really 2 days since you had the letter. We should have acted before this. You have no further evidence, I suppose, that which detail in the place before us? No suggestive detail which might help us?
There's one thing, said John Openshaw.
He rummaged in his coat pockets, drawing out a piece of discolored, blue-tinted paper. He laid it out upon the table.
I have some remembrance, he said, that on the day when my uncle burned the papers I observed that small, unburned margins which lay amid the ashes in a particular color. I found this single sheet upon the floor of his room. I am inclined to think that it may be one of the papers which has, perhaps, floated away from the others, and in that way has escaped destruction. Beyond the mention of Pips, I do not see that it helps us much. I think, myself, that the page from his private diary. The writing is undoubtedly my uncle's.
Holmes moved the lamp, and we both bent over the sheet of paper, which showed to be by its ragged edge that it was indeed torn from a book. It was headed March 1869, and beneath were the following enigmatical notes. 4th, Hudson came, same plantation. 7th, set the pips on McCartney, Paramore, John Swaim of St. Augustine. 9th, Macaulay cleared. 10th, John Swain cleared. 12th, visited Paramore. All well. Thank you, said Holmes, folding up the paper and returning it to our visitor. Now you must on no account lose another instant. We cannot spare time even to discuss what you have told me. You must get home instantly and act.
What shall I do?
There's but one thing to do. It must be done at once. You must put this piece of paper which you have shown us into the brass box which you have described. You must also put the note to say that all the pieces of paper were burned by your uncle, and this is the only one which remains. You must assert that in such words as will carry conviction with them. Having done this, you must put the box at once upon the sundial, as directed. Do you understand?
Entirely.
Do not think of revenge or anything of the sort at present. I think that we may gain that by means of the law. But we have our web to weave, and theirs is already woven. The first consideration is to remove the pressing danger that threatens you. The second is to clear up any mystery as to the punishment of the guilty parties.
I thank you, said the young man, rising and pulling up his trench coat. You have given me fresh life and hope. I shall certainly do as you advise.
Do not lose an instant, and above all, take care of yourself in the meanwhile, for I do not think that there can be a doubt that you are threatened by a very real and imminent danger. How do you go back?
By train from Waterloo.
It is not yet 9. The streets will be crowded, so do not trust that you may be in safety, and yet you cannot guard yourself too closely.
I am armed.
That is well. Tomorrow I shall set work upon your case.
I shall see you in Horsham, then?
No, your secret lies in London. It is there I shall seek it.
Then I shall call upon you in a day, or in 2 days, news of the boxes and the papers. I shall take your advice in very particular order.
He shook his hands with us, and took his leave. Outside, the wind was still screaming, and the rain splashed and pattered against the windows. This strange, wild story seemed to have come to us from amid the mad elements, blown in upon us like a sheet of weed on the gale, and now to have reabsorbed by them once more.
Sherlock Holmes sat for some time in silence, with his head sunk forward and his eyes bent on the red glowing of the fire. Then he lit his pipe, and leaning back in his chair, he watched the blue smoke rings as they chased each other up to the ceiling. "I think, Watson," he remarked at last, "that of all our cases we have had some more fantastic than this. Well, perhaps a sign of 4. Oh, yes, say perhaps that. And yet Sir John Openshaw seems to me to be walking amid even greater perils than that of Strotus." "But have you," I asked, "formed any definite conclusion as to what the perils are?" "There can be no question of this nature," he answered. "Then what are they? Who is this K.K.K., and why does he pursue this unhappy family?" Sherlock Holmes closed his eyes and placed his elbows upon the arms of his chair, and with his fingertips together. "The ideal reasoner," he remarked, "would, when he had been shown the single fact in all its bearings, deduce from it not only that the chain of events which led up to it, but also the results which would follow from it, as Cuvier could correctly describe a whole animal by the contemplation of a single bone. To the observer who has thoroughly understood one link in the series of incidents, should be able to accurately state all the other ones, both before and after. We have not yet grasped the results which the reason alone can attain to. Problems may be solved in the study which have baffled all those who have sought a solution by the aid of their senses. To carry the art, however, to the highest pitch, it is necessary that the reasoner should be able to utilize all the facts which have come to his knowledge, and this in its belief implies, as you will readily see, a possession of all knowledge which, even in these days of free education and encyclopedias, is a somewhat rare accomplishment. It is not impossible, however, that a man should possess all knowledge which is likely to be useful for him in his work, and this I have endeavored in my case to do. If I remember correctly, you on one occasion, in the early days of our friendship, defined my limits in a very precise fashion." "Yes," I answered, laughing. "It was a singular document. Philosophy, astronomy, and politics were marked at 0, as I remember. Botany variable, geology profound, as regards the mud stands of the region of 15 miles of town, chemistry eccentric, anatomy unsystematic, sensational literature, and a crime records unique, violin player, boxer, swordsman, lawyer, and self-poisoner by cocaine and tobacco. Those, I think, were the main points of my analysis." Holmes grinned at the time. "Well," he said, "I say now, as I say then, that a man should be kept his little brain addled shock with the furniture that he is likely to use, and the rest he can put away in the lumber room in his library, where he can get to it if he wants it. Now, for such a case as the one we have been submitted to, we need certainly to muster all our resources. Kindly hand me down the letter K from the American Encyclopedia, which stands on the shelf beside you." "Thank you. Now let us consider the situation and see what may be deduced from it. In the first place, we may start with a strong presumption that Colonel Openshaw had some very strong reason for leaving America. Men at his time of life do not change all their habits in exchange for charming climates in Florida, for the lonely life of an English provincial town. His extreme love for the solitude of England suggests the idea that he was in fear of something or someone, so we may assume as a working hypothesis that it was fear of someone or something which drove him from America. As to what it was he feared, we can only deduce that it is by considering of the formidable letters which were received by himself and his successors. Do you remark the postmarks of those letters?" "The first was Pondicherry, the second from Dundee, and the third from London." "From East London. What do you deduce from that?" Well, there are all seaports, and the writer was on board of a ship. Excellent. We have already a clue. There can be no doubt that the strong probability, is that the writer was on board of a ship. And now let us consider another point. In the case of Pondicherry, 7 weeks elapsed between the threat and its fulfillment. Is Dundee, it is not only 3 or 4 days. Does that suggest anything? A greater distance of travel. But the letter also had a greater distance to come. Then I do not see the point. There is at least a presumption that the vessel in which the man or men are is a sailing ship. It looks as if they have always sent their singular warning or token before them when starting on the mission. You see how quickly the deed followed the sign when it came to Dundee. If there had come from Pondicherry in a steamer, it would have arrived almost as soon as their letter. But, as a matter of fact, 7 weeks elapsed. I think that those 7 weeks represented the difference between the main boat that brought the letter to the sailing vessel which brought the writer. It is possible. More than that, it's probable. And now you see the deadly urgency of the new case, and why I urge young Openshaw with caution. The blow has always fallen at the end of some time it would take the senders to travel the distance. But this one comes from London, therefore we could not count upon a delay. Good God! I cried. What can it mean? This relentless persecution! The papers which Openshaw carried are obviously of vital importance to the person or persons in the sailing ship. I think that it is quite clear that there must be some more than one of them. A single man could not have carried out 2 deaths in such a way as to deserve a coroner's jury. There must have been several in it, and they must be men of resource and determination. There are papers they mean to have, and be the holder of them it may be. In this way, you can see K.K.K. ceases to be the initials of an individual and becomes a badge of a society. But what society? Have you never, said Sherlock Holmes, bending forward and sinking his voice, have you never heard of the Ku Klux Klan? I never have. Holmes turned over the leaves of the book upon the knee. Here it is, he said presently. Ku Klux Klan, a name derived with a fanciful resemblance of a sound pronounced by the cocking of a rifle. This terrible society was formed by some ex-Confederate soldiers in the southern states after the Civil War. It has rapidly formed local branches in multiple parts of the country, notably in Tennessee, Florida, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. Its power was used for political purposes, principally for the terrorizing of Negro voters and the murdering of driving from the country of those who were opposed to its views. Its outrages were usually preceded by a warning sent by the marked man in some fantastic but generally recognized shape. A sprig of oak leaves in some parts, melon seeds or orange pips in others. On receiving this, the victim might either bravely abjure his former ways, or might fly from the country. If he braved the matter out, death would unfallingly come upon him, and usually in some strange and unforeseen manner. So perfect was the organization of the society, that in systematic methods, that there is hardly a case upon record where any man succeeded in braving it with impunity, or in which any of its outrages were traced home to the perpetrators. For some years the organization flourished in spite of the efforts of the United States government and of the better classes of the community in the South. Eventually, in the year 1869, the movement rather suddenly collapsed. Although there have been sporadic outbreaks of the same sort since that date. You observe, said Holmes, laying down the volume, that the sudden breaking up of society was coincidental with the disappearance of Openshaw from America with their papers. It may well be that's the cause and effect. It is no wonder that he and his family have some of the more implacable spirits upon their track. You can understand that this register and diary may implicate some of the first men in the South, and that there may be covered many that will not sleep until it is recovered. And the page we've seen is such as we might expect. It ran, if I remember right, sent a pips to A, B, and C, that is, sent the Society's warning to them, and there are successive entries that A, B, and left the country, and finally that C was visited, with, I fear, a sinister result for C. Well, I think, Doctor, that we may let some light into this dark place, and I believe that the only chance young Openshaw has in the meantime is to do what I have told him to. There is nothing more to be said or to be done tonight, so hand me over my violin and let us try to forget for half an hour the miserable weather and the still more miserable ways of our fellowmen. It had cleared in the morning, and the sun was shining with subdued brightness through the dim veil which hangs over this great city. Sherlock Holmes was already at breakfast when I came down. "You'll excuse me for not waking you," he said. I foresee a very busy day ahead of me looking into this case of young Openshaw's." "What steps will you take?" I asked. "It will very much depend upon the results of my first inquiries. I may go down to Horsham, after all." "You will not go there first?" "No, I shall commence in the city. Just ring the bell, and the maid will bring you your coffee." As I waited, I lifted the unopened newspaper from the table and glanced my eye over it. It rested upon the headline which sent a chill into my heart. "Holmes!" I cried. "You are too late." "Ah," said he, laying down his cup. "I feared as much. How was it done?" He spoke calmly, but I could see that he was deeply moved. My sight caught the name of the John Openshaw and the heading "Tragedy near Waterloo Bridge." Here's the account. "Between 9 and 10 last night, Police Constable Cook of the H Division, on duty near Waterloo Bridge, heard a cry for help and a splash in the water. The night, however, was extremely dark and stormy, so that, in spite of the help of several passer-by, it was quite impossible to effect a rescue. The alarm, however, was given, and by the aid of the water police, the body was eventually recovered. It proved to be that of the young gentleman whose name, as it appears from an envelope which was found in his pocket, was John Openshaw, and whose residence is near Horsham. It is conjectured that he may be hurrying down to catch the last train from Waterloo Station, and that in his haste and his extreme darkness he missed the path and walked over the edge of one of the small landing places for the river steamboats. The body exhibited no traces of violence, and there can be no doubt that the deceased had been the victim of an unfortunate accident, which should have been the effect of calling the attention of the authorities to the condition of the riverside landing stages." We sat in silence for some moments, Holmes more depressed and shaken than I had ever seen him. "That hurts my pride, Watson," he said at last. "It is a petty feeling, no doubt, but it hurts my pride. It becomes a personal matter with me now, and if God sends me health, I shall set my hand upon this gang. That he should come to me for help, and that I should send him away to his death." He sprang from his chair and paced about the room in an uncontrollable agitation, with a flush upon his sallow cheeks and a nervous clasping and unclasping of his long, thin hands. They must be cunning devils, he exclaimed at last. How could they have decoyed him down there? The embankment is not in the direct line of the station. The bridge, no doubt, was too crowded, even on such a night as for their purpose. Well, Watson, we shall see who will win in the long run. I'm going out now. To the police? No, I shall be my own police. When I have spun the web, they may take the flies, but not before. All day as I was engaged in my professional work, and it was late in the evening before I returned to Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes had not yet come back. It was nearly 10 o'clock before he entered, looking pale and worn. He walked up to the sideboard, and tearing a piece from the loaf, he devoured it voraciously, washing it down with a long draught of water. "You're hungry," I remarked. "Starving. It had escaped my memory. I have nothing since breakfast." "Nothing?" "Not a bite. I had no time to think of it." "And have you succeeded?" "Well?" "You have a clue?" "I have them in the hollow of my hand. Young Openshaw shall not remain unavenged. Why, Watson, let us put their own devilish trademark upon them. It is well thought of." "What do you mean?" He took an orange from the cupboard, and tearing into it, he squeezed at the pips onto the table. Of these he took 5 and thrust them into an envelope. On the side of the envelope he wrote S.J. for J.O. Then he sealed it and addressed it to Captain James Calhoun, bark, Lone Star, Savannah, Georgia. That will await him when he enters port, and he, chuckling, it may give him a sleepless night. He will find it to be a precursor of his fate, as Openshaw did before him. And who is Captain Calhoun? The leader of the gang. I shall have the others, but he first. How did you trace it, then? He took a large sheet of paper from his pocket and he covered with dates and names. I have spent the whole day, he said, over Lloyd's registers and files of old papers, following the future career of every vessel which touched the Potted in January and February in '83. There were 36 ships of fair tonnage which were reported during those. One of these, the Lone Star, instantly attracted my attention, since, although it was reported of having cleared from London, the name is that of which was given to one of the states of the Union. Texas, I think. I was not, and am not sure which, but I drew the ship must have been of American origin. What then? I searched the Dundee records, and when I found that the bark Lone Star had there in January '85, my suspicion became a certainty. Then I inquired as to which vessels which lay in the present port of London. Yes? The Lone Star had arrived there last week. I went down to Albert Dock and found that she had been taken down by the river by the early tide this morning, homeward bound to Savannah. I wired the Gravesend and learned that she had passed some time, and that the wind was easterly. I have no doubt that she is now past the Goodwins, and not very far from the Isle of Wight. What will you do now? Oh, I have my hand upon them. He and 2 mates are, as I learned, the only native-born Americans in the ship. The others are Finns and Germans. I know, also, that they were all 3 away from the ship that night, had it from the Storyteller who had been loading the ship. By the time that their sailing ship arrived in Savannah by mailboat will be carried this letter, and the cable will have informed the police of Savannah that 3 gentlemen were badly wanted here upon the charge of murder. And there is ever a flaw, however, and the best laid of human plans that the murderers of John Openshaw were never to receive the orange pips which would allow them to land upon the other, as cunning and as resolute themselves was upon their track. Very long and very severe were the eloquential gales that year. We waited long for news of the Savannah, of the Lone Star of Savannah, but none ever reached us. We did at last hear that somewhere out in the far Atlantic a shattered sternpost of the boat had been swinging in the trough of a wave, with the letters LS carved upon it. And that is all which we know of the late Lone Star.